All right, Security Weekly News wrap up for the week of 6 September 2020 on location. Basically, is your old Pornhub account haunting you? 666 is the number of the counting. Insider threats are huge. BLURtooth, Apple COVID-19 opt-ins, Space Force, and everyone is trying to interfere with the election. All this and more on this episode of Security Weekly News Wrap Up.
This is Security Weekly. For security professionals, by security professionals.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
It's the show that keeps you up to date on the latest security news twice a week. Your trusted source for accurate security information and expert analysis. It's time for Security Weekly News. Do you know where your organization's crown jewel data is, whose data it is, what it contains, and if it's flagged, tagged, and classified accurately? Defense in Depth requires discovery in depth. At BigID, they help organizations uncover dark data, classify sensitive and regulated data, meet compliance requirements, and take action for data on-prem, in the cloud, and everywhere in between. Learn more about how Discovery in Depth can change the way enterprise organizations find, classify, and protect sensitive data at securityweekly.com/BigID. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM.
All right, it's Security Weekly News Wrap Up. I'm Doug White from Roger Williams University with you on location today because I had something else. All right, first the shows from the week. On Enterprise Security Weekly number 197, John, Matt, and Paul had a micro interview with Corey Bodson, the CTO of Deepwatch, and Michael Sanders, the senior engineer at ExtraHop. These two topics were about how mature is my security organization, and secondly, how fast you respond to compromise. I like the micro interviews. They're kind of fun things to look at. They go pretty quick. They did a second micro interview with Ian McShane, who's the VP at CrowdStrike, and Michael Borowski, who's the director of software engineering at Synopsys. Again, fun. Ian McShane, always a fun person to hear what he has to say. The segment covered a discussion about stopping and regrouping at some point to evaluate your security posture. Primarily, I know that Ian McShane he was on my show a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about how, that the COVID-19 changes sent everyone home, and now we're sort of in this interregnum in between. Everyone went home, everyone comes back. Maybe not everyone comes back in the future. So kind of an interesting thing about it's maybe a good time to stop and evaluate your security posture now that things are sort of stable, but probably will change again soon. And also the second part of that was factoring API security into your overall security strategy, which is certainly something that people have needed to talk about for a long time, but are just really starting to think is a real issue, even though it really has been a real issue for a long time. And they had a news segment on there. On Security Weekly News number 63, Jason Wood was back to talk about a creepy geofence warrant. And that's a very interesting story about sort of a modern law enforcement technique I have been interested in for a long, long time, which essentially is about, I remember a long time ago telling people you could stop almost all crime by putting cameras literally everywhere. Putting chips in people so you know who they are. Geofencing is essentially looking for devices that communicate at crime scenes or other locations of interest. And there's a lot of controversy around how that might work. And, there was a case that Jason talked about where someone borrowed someone else's phone, and sort of the first person got grabbed, and they weren't there, and then there's this whole, and having an alibi and all these things is great, but it sure is a big hassle when they come break down your front door because they think you were involved in a murder scene or something. So there's a lot of discussion around how warrants may be used and how they're going to get issued for this geofencing kind of stuff. On Security and Compliance Weekly number 42, Jeff, John, Josh, and Scott had Oleg Shimonko, who's the head of business development and the co-founder of Egren, and he joined the crew to talk about Egren's threat protection platform in the first half, and then in the second half he was there as well, and this time they were talking about how Egren is PCI compliant. So an interesting segment there about that. On Paul's Security Weekly number 666, which is the total of all the numbers on a roulette wheel. It's also a great William Blake painting, if you like William Blake paintings. It's also an Iron Maiden album. But it is actually reputedly not the actual number mentioned in certain religious texts that gave it all this fame, despite the fact that everybody thinks it is. It actually is. That's highly disputed, because apparently in the original scroll the number is 616. But, I guess we could get into some kind of elaborate religious debate that would result in a holy war over which number was actually correct, and would end in lots of tattoos and the end of civilization as we know it. It was, however, the 666 episode of Security Weekly. The first segment was with Roy Cohn and David Ashraf from Vicarious. They were talking about their technique, Vicarious, which allows an in-memory virtual path that did not require binaries to be altered in order to patch. So I think this is a very interesting topic. And it was, to me, very intriguing. So definitely check that segment out. That's sort of a new idea and is very, very cool. In the second segment, Sumedh Thakar, who's always a great guest, joined the show. Sumedh is the Chief Product Officer at Qualys, and the discussion was about DevOps because that's kind of his thing. And it was mostly about, again, this issue of how do you integrate security into your overall workflow as you develop new things, which is something, again, we've all been harping about for a long time and not gotten a lot of traction because people tend to want to go through the traditional sort of development of getting it done and don't like adding steps to that whole workflow process when you're trying to build something and get it out there. The show also marked the return of Larry Pesci to the stage, where he performed a tearful rendition of "You Are the Wind Beneath My Wings" to Paul. And of course, they did the news. My favorite threat of the week is going to be old accounts. So there was an article that was listed with Paul Security Weekly last night. And a lot of us, at least for me, when I read that article, I started thinking about just how long I had been doing this. And by this, I mean being involved in the interweb. And my first online accounts that I actually had that were not just something private like CompuServe or Sierra Online, which ran on their server and was a dial-in type system. And I know that CompuServe migrated then to the internet later. But initially, CompuServe, AOL, and all that. So I wasn't really thinking so much about those because I think those systems are gone. But the original accounts I had were in the late 90s that I started actually, going on and saying, wow, here's a site I need to register. I think one of the first sites I did actually register on the internet was CompuServe because I used that for travel booking. But that basically ends up being about 2 decades for me of games, email systems, gaming platforms, calendars, email systems, bulletin boards, you name it, including ones I was running. I ran a Comet email server back in the 90s, and I know I had an account on it. For all I know, it's still sitting there. So how many do you have? I mean, this was sort of what the point of this article was how many altogether since you ever started being on the internet in any sort of form or fashion, and it may have been when you were even a child if you're a lot younger than some of us. So you may have 10, 50, hundreds of sites that you have registered for, signed up, created passwords. You probably do some almost every day. I know I did one yesterday because I wanted to order something from a restaurant. They wanted you to register. So, I used one of my throwaways. But, well, the story anyway says that it's probably hundreds for most people. So add to that, how many of those did you use your email address or some standard username that you use all the time and the same password over and over and over again, especially when you think about children. I know people say, oh, you should be supervising every single thing your child does. And I have to say that I remember when I was young, back in the dark ages, and I remember all the things I did that my parents wanted to supervise that they were unable to supervise. And so keep dreaming that dream if you think you can supervise every single thing your child does. But you may have created passwords that were insecure and so forth. So you want credential stuffing? That's how you get credential stuffing. So all those old systems are out there. Maybe you don't use them anymore. Maybe it's something you don't even remember, you don't log into anymore. There's definitely a likelihood they either will get compromised or they have been compromised at some point in history, and that data has been disclosed. And now that email and password combo you've been using since you were 9 or whenever your family unit allowed you to use that kind of stuff. And how long is that? And how long are those things out there? Is it really just your birthday backwards with your grandmother's initials in place of the dashes? And oh, hang on, I need to change my login for a second because that. Yeah, well, no, I'm kidding, but who knows? I mean, I started thinking about that when I read this article. Maybe your old Sony MegaNet account, is still sitting out there somewhere on a server, and you have no idea it's there, and it's been there for years, and you used the login when you were 12 years old and created some password that meant something to you, and maybe you're still using that password. I hope not, but, it may still be out there. So what to do about all this? Out there somewhere, there's a database of cold, unwanted, unencrypted, the island of unwanted accounts. So it's a tough one. Trying to get your people to stop using the same credentials everywhere is a difficult task, and it's a start. But the article's kind of interesting, talking about some steps you may want to take examining your various fossilized footprints on the interweb. So basically, they started with, try to list all your accounts. So, good luck with that. Yeah, I mean, I could probably list the 10 I use all the time, but I have no idea. And then, look through your old emails. But then they did get around to some kind of good ideas. Looking at data leakage tracking sites, obviously, there are those out there, like Have I Been Pwned? Hack Check are sites that you can look at with these usernames and see if they're out there. Username leverage sites, which are kind of interesting one to me, about the idea that there are sites that will see how many hits you get on certain usernames. And the idea behind these, of course, is to see how important or popular someone is, but you can also use them to see, is this really well known out there that, that D White or whatever is all over the place, not to mention how many other people use the same names that you have. But, all that's out there. And of course, all of it leads back to our continual litany of don't use the same passwords, use multi-factor authentication and all this kind of stuff. But we all do it. We've all used the same password probably somewhere in our history on the same site. So be sure that you're not doing that as you go forward. I kind of went, a long time ago to a tiered system where I just use, and a lot of you do this too, throw away emails and passwords on sites I really don't care about, like that restaurant site the other night. I have an email address. It's an actual email address, but I only use it for stuff like that. So I hardly ever look at it, and only if I have to authenticate something do I go check that site. And, I definitely use throwaway passwords on that. In fact, my plan on that is I reset the password every time. I don't even try to remember it. I just throw a random strong password in there. And the next time I need to go to that restaurant, I'll just do a password reset and check my throwaway email account. I just do think this is an interesting threat. And considering how many audits I saw where dead people were still listed with admin credentials in the system, and how often we see credential stuffing attacks going on, it may well be time to start thinking about this kind of like historical cleanups. This is sort of the, getting the trash out of the basement kind of thing, which I also need to do that, I think. But obviously, password vaulting is the mainstream choice that is recommended, but even those have to be protected so carefully, and they're hard to manage for a lot of users. I did spend a lot of time with this with my dad, trying to get him to use like a password vaulting service, and it didn't really work. My dad was a really smart guy, but he had some kind of block with technology, and as he got older, it was really challenging for him to try to deal with anything like that. And I finally just had to come up with a written rule set that worked for him, so that he would actually follow these rules that we had sort of established for how he could decide, do I give them my email address? Do I need to do something different? So until we get around to some kind of identity system, it's probably going to be a threat that's not going to go away. And it's not going to be that long until some of us will be talking about 3 decades worth of old accounts that are probably laying around out there. And now all the top news from all the shows. I will lead again with a story that Security Weekly was sold to Cyber Risk Alliance as of 8 September. That was when the official press release came out. This was a move to expand the brand of Security Weekly and reach a larger audience going forward. It'd still be called Security Weekly, still same fun times, but going to be owned by a new company. The journey of 1,000 acquisitions begins with a single cup of coffee or something like that. But Cyber Risk Alliance is probably, for most of us, most commonly associated with InfoSec World Conference, and they do have a large media brand already established, and I'm sure would like to expand that as well. So the plan, of course, is to expand content at Security Weekly, viewers for Security Weekly, and so forth. But you can read the press release on the wiki if you'd like. Big Glass 2020 Insider Big Glass 2020 reported an insider threat report. Okay, let me try that again. The Big Glass 2020 Insider Threat Report was released and had some damning numbers about insider attacks. 61% of their respondents had at least one insider threat attack that was conducted in the last year, and 22% of them had 6 or more. I mean, wow. But I guess I was initially sort of surprised, and then I started thinking about it going, the insiders have the means, they have the motive, they have the time to enact attacks on the organization, and they also have the greatest amount of access. You don't need to move laterally and enhance your credentials if you already have enhanced credentials. So, and if you've never seen a disgruntled programmer who's angry about not having any more Mountain Dew in the fridge downstairs have a hissy fit on the floor and end up ugly crying in the hallway, well, you haven't worked with very many programmers, probably. And don't even get me started on networking admins and their strange desire for pineapple chipotle beef jerky at 3 o'clock in the morning, or they just can't take it anymore. Not that any of those things ever really happened, right? And they weren't me. And I don't like pineapple chipotle beef jerky or Mountain Dew, but I do know people that do. So probably need to think about that some more as you go forward. Are Microsoft's August in 2004, so that's the May patch that came out for Windows 10, ready for install yet? So this story was basically talking about some of the problems that came up with the August patch set, as well as the 2004 now infamous patch set. 2004 was a major Windows 10 update that started being released in May and has been fraught with peril. I did a test install of this when it became available for me, and they started telling me I needed to install it, and it basically bombed everything on my test install. It literally wiped out all the drivers. It was unbelievable. What a mess. And I chose not to install it on my main, like this system that I'm using right here, because I was worried it was not going to be what I was hoping. Apparently, the August Windows and Office patches for Windows 8.1 can crash your VPN. Windows 7 patches were crashing printers, and on and on and on. And I really wish that while we constantly yell about patching, that the patches were a little bit more stable. And I realize they can't test everything and every possible outcome, but they tell people to patch, they pressure you to patch, they release these urgent critical patches, and then you put them on your system and it brings the whole world to a screeching halt. And that's really difficult from a support side perspective. So I still don't think that Windows 2004 update is really ready for prime time, but I did get it to work on my test system, although I had to reinstall all the drivers for everything that was on there, and a lot of the software had to be reinstalled. And Hello Face, this was a big thing they were touting about why you wanted this, was this Microsoft single sign-on with a face print kind of thing, actually sort of turned into a face plant. I got interested in it because I talked with a lot of Microsoft people a couple of years ago about Hello. It sounded really exciting, but Hello requires an expensive camera update to a camera that's been certified to work. And then of course I went and got the camera, a Logitech Brio, which is a top of the line Logitech, says it works. Guess what? Doesn't work. Apparently, it only works if you remove all these other products like Logi and all this other stuff that you kind of have to have. Then, so it was one of those IBM kind of updates where you basically got screwed. So basically, Hello wants you to use Microsoft and only Hello, and you kind of have to purge your system of all other things. But, keep your sims running and test your patches. But, you do need to have a solid patching plan and testing plan in effect, or somebody will take advantage of you. In fact, FireEye found that more attackers were using 0 days in 2019 than in any of the previous 3 years. They reported they expect this to continue in the coming years, which is in line for me with patching stuff, in that we have, as we remove the low-hanging fruit, we're forcing attackers into that narrow part of the spectrum. If they're ever, and if we want to keep security under control, we're going to have to keep doing that. NIST did focus on this recently and added the requirement of runtime application self-protection, which is called RASP, to the latest draft application of their security framework. And if you aren't familiar with RASP, it basically is a runtime protection for apps and updates the OWASP top 10, and also apparently detects 0-day attacks. I have not tested that product, but the article is kind of an ad for K2, but it's still important thoughts about RASP and about these 0-day movements. Cisco did release a patch for the Jabber Flaw, which I mentioned on Tuesday. The CVE 2020-3040-95 had a 9.9 out of 10 and represented the ability to remote code execute in Windows version of Jabber. If you don't know what Jabber is, and I actually didn't when I first saw it, it's sort of Cisco's version of a Discord-like platform that supports video conferencing and instant messaging and all this kind of thing. Basically, it was an XMPP flaw that allowed injection of content into unvalidated messages. Cisco did release a patch last week for this critical flaw, and they said they had no evidence that this flaw was being actively exploited, but it does sound pretty bad given that, 0-day stuff that we were talking about just a minute ago. Microsoft is warning various companies involved in the presidential campaigns in the United States for November 3rd election that Russian agents and others are actively attempting to target pretty much everyone. Apparently, numerous attempts on both campaigns have been conducted with credential stuffing, password spraying, phishing, etc. And Microsoft had detected these attacks, and they so far had associated the unsuccessful attacks they detected with groups in Russia, China, and Iran. Microsoft indicated that thousands of attacks by a group they call Zirconium had occurred on the candidates, staffers, and companies representing the candidates between March and September, and had resulted in around 150 documented compromises so far. Zirconium has primarily been focused on Joe Biden, his staffers, and prominent members of the international affairs academic community at about 15 universities. Microsoft had another one called Phosphorus, which was apparently from Iran, and Charming Kitten was also involved in this, and they were targeting staff accounts associated with the Trump campaign. Fancy Bear and other Russian APTs were also using credential harvesting and phishing attacks. Basically, it's an interesting read, and it definitely with the election coming up in 2 months, it sounds like everyone's getting on board the election attack train. The BLURtooth, I think it's BLURtooth, flaw allows bypass of authentication keys and allows you to sniff devices which use Bluetooth 4 and 5. This is a high-severity flaw, CVE 2020-15-802, which was discovered by EPFL and Purdue University. Basically, this flaw occurs in the pairing process during what is called the cross-transport key derivation, and it allows the key to be overwritten, which means that profiles, services, and other things that are being shared by these Bluetooth devices and stored on the Bluetooth devices may well be accessed without authentication. It's definitely an interesting attack, and it's worth a read if you're supporting any Bluetooth stuff. Apple released an update that has built-in COVID-19 tracking, and I got that update last night. Apparently it is an opt-in because that was what the message said. My phone updated to this version of iOS. The Electronic Frontiers Foundation said that both Apple and Android needed to put some guardrails around their COVID-19 tools because they're beginning to intrude on the privacy of users. All these are related, of course, to contact tracing apps, which are being rolled out in states and countries all around the world. And basically, these things allow tracking of COVID-19 outbreaks and clusters. And of course, there have been a lot of issues with this with various states and countries. Some of them had to pull their apps back. And of course, just the general idea that your phone may be tracking you. Hint, it is. And it already was, but it gives some people the vapors. Colorado is using the Exposure Notifications Express system, which is what Apple calls this product, and apparently it's going to appear on the Android platform as well in conjunction with Google. So as states keep rolling this out, EFF is trying to keep track of all the privacy issues that are occurring with these systems. Apple and Google have both promised in the past that they will not track your whereabouts or report them to anyone, but all these new rollouts are starting to do just that, and EFF is basically saying they're not fully vetted. And finally, apparently, in addition to the much maligned United States Space Force, which was created earlier this year, the Trump administration published Space Policy Directive Number 5, which is called Cybersecurity Principles for Space Systems. I kind of laugh because it all sounds so, almost silly, but it actually isn't that bad. I mean, it's very vague, but basically what it says is that cybersecurity, that you should use cybersecurity informed engineering, and that all plans should verify the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of critical functions, which all sounds like common sense, but these military entities have to have directives in order to do these things. It's vague. And Space Force sounds kind of goofy to me, but hey, they have a patch and uniforms and all kinds of stuff. So, it's a start, I guess. I mean, why not? And that's the news wrap up for the week of 6 September 2020 in the time of plague. I'm Doug White from the already online cybersecurity program at Roger Williams University, and I will see you next week on the network that never shuts down, Security Weekly. Read all the science and stay safe.